So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And I don't have anything that I would describe as a revelation associated with this. We're basically going to be looking at some activities that we've been reporting on for some time here. And so first thing, I mean, this is literally the same slide that we've been looking at for several weeks now. This is SSH Probes on port 1900 UDP. We have speculated for the most part that this is searching around looking for this simple service directory protocol that could be used for reflection attacks. We have not seen any significant evidence of reflection attacks using this service, but it is one that there are actually two contributors to the activity that we see here. One is what I would describe as some innocuous activity, that is folks that are doing reporting purposes, trying to identify servers that respond to this service. We also have some other activity. It continues to be from a Russian address that is also probing on this port from time to time. Most of the cyclical activity is associated with this, what I would describe as innocuous probing activity from a known organization. Next item here, again, very similar in terms of possibility. This one's a little bit different, I guess, in the sense that we're seeing it, but still sort of a repeat of activity. SSH Probes on port 53 TCP, and this is DNS, usually associated when we're using TCP for DNS, is associated with zone transfers. Most of these probes are from a single address in China. I presume that they are looking for DNS servers that will support a zone transfer so they can identify what names are authoritative for that server.
Yeah, well, the other use for TCP, DNS over TCP, is for large responses, but generally that's not useful for reflection attacks, which is where we see most of our DNS attacking coming from. So, because you can't spoof the source on a TCP connection. So.
Right, and to a large extent, because of the extensions that have been put on DNS, it allows actually to use fragmented UDP to provide large responses. That was done partly to support DNSSEC, and so we see less and less of that activity using TCP, although a lot of servers will kind of revert to that, or perhaps firewalls will force that to occur, and if they're concerned about UDP fragmentation. So good point, Jim. Next item here is SSH Probes. This one's new. SSH Probes on port 2425 UDP. This is actually registered to Fujitsu Application Manager. We're looking at 30 days of activity here. It's also associated with a tool called IP Messenger, which is not a particularly current tool. It's a tool that came out, I think, around in 1996. It doesn't seem to have had too many updates to it over the last couple of years or so. But in any case, we're seeing probing on this port. Most probes and sources are from China in this case, and there are some other sources from other parts of Asia. So one possibility here is that there are perhaps some applications that are more local to the Asian region or more popular in the Asian region that are being probed for here. It's not really clear, but I guess the one thing that would be clear is if you do have applications that are using port 2425 UDP, you want to take a look at that and see if there's any possibility of a problem there.
What do we know about Fujitsu App Manager as a service?
Very little.
Okay. Well, if I would speculate, it would be that this is some sort of software management for across an enterprise?
It likely is. I kind of discounted that a little bit here because it's both the TCP and the UDP port that's registered to this application, and typically when I think of a application manager, it's most likely going to be more using the TCP port as opposed to the UDP port. In fact, I think of the literature that I'd seen, that was generally the case. So when I see the UDP, to me it sounds more like a messaging application connection list, sort of, toss something over. And so that's why I kind of focus more toward perhaps the IP messenger, but that's really speculative. And actually, it's good that you brought that up because I intended to mention that.
Yeah, and if anybody out there happens to capture packets, we'd love to see them.
Definitely.
Yes, absolutely. All right, good. So let's take a look at the next one here. This one is, I think we reported on some similar activity a few weeks ago here. SSH Probes on port 222 TCP. This is actually registered to an application RSH SPX authentication. So it's actually a special, I think, authentication method that's used for a remote shell. In this case, it's a single source in China that's performing this activity. In this case, that single source has also been known do probing on port 22 TCP as well as 2222 TCP. So we have a couple of possibilities. They may in fact be looking for the RSH, I'm guessing not, based on this other activity. I suspect that what they're looking for is perhaps alternative ports that are being used for SSH. You know, that's speculation on my part, but certainly there's a case here where we've seen some blips in activity over the last 30 days, but more recently over the last several days, some more intense activity scanning on this port. And we have the top 10 most probed ports here, port 22 TCP being at the top of the list, followed by 445 TCP, 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database, 23 TCP, that's Telnet, 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, 53 UDP, DNS, 443 TCP, that would be HTTPS, perhaps looking for websites that would be vulnerable to certain types of vulnerabilities. Port 80 TCP as well. Now, I think last week we took a look at the long-term activity on port 22 TCP, so we're not going to look at that again this time. We do have some additional variety, but clearly this 22 TCP, and we've seen some other ports associated with that, port 5000, port 23, have been significantly associated with internet-connected devices that are being targeted. In terms of the most sources that are doing probing, we have at the top of the list here port 445 TCP, and that's followed by port 23 TCP, port 80, port 8080, port 443, port 27015. I think that's associated with some gaming activity, and then we have a port 16470 that's associated with a zero access botnet P2P, which has been basically disabled. Considering the two top ones here, port 445 and port 23, I thought we would take a little longer term view at each of those. First on deck here is port 445 TCP. This is associated with a service management block that is used by Microsoft. Most of this activity we generally attribute to configure infection. What we're looking at here is actually the last 365 days. If you've seen in some previous programs, we've looked at the P2P activity associated with the zero access botnet, and if you were to look at the 1 year graph, you'd see a pretty significant downturn or degradation or you know, fewer devices that are continuing that activity over time. Unfortunately, it's not the same story for what appears to be configure infected devices. Even over the last year, we see, you know, a little bit of downward trend here, but generally it's been staying flat around, on average, I would say about 22,000 devices that we see scanning at any given time of the day. There may be different devices at different times of the day that are visible. And then if we look at the same period of time for port 23 TCP, again, that's Telnet, looking at the last 365 days or the last year, what we see is a significant uptick in activity near the end of January, and since then we've seen what appears to be some reduction in that activity, but it's still significant in the grand scheme of things here. Again, we generally associate that with a worm or infections of internet-connected devices that are going out and trying to infect others as well.